So what's your direction here as far as questions? What would you like to know?
I'd like to know everything.
Good luck if you get there. I've been trying to know everything my whole life, as my wife will attest to, and I'm not doing very well.
And my final word is there is.
Okay.
Where were you born?
I was born in Long Branch, New Jersey. My family moved around a lot. And my parents, my brother and two sisters had been in the Philippines during the war, were captured by the Japanese and interned in a concentration camp for 3 years in Manila. And after they were liberated by MacArthur, they came back to the States, and my father took jobs here, and I was born a year after the camp. He was a YMCA secretary, so he was in overseas work when he was young. Went out to the Philippines in 1928, I believe the year was, and worked in several YMCAs in the Philippines. And when the Japanese came in, he was advised by the YMCA that if the Americans fled precipitously, it was going to send the wrong message to the Filipinos. And they were asking all the Americans who were in public service to stay, and missionaries and such, and they stayed too long. So they were all captured and interned. So I was born a year after the war in Long Branch, New Jersey, and he was in a YMCA position there as well. His parents were missionaries in China, and they were also YMCA people. YMCA, when it originally started, was an evangelical organization, and they were considered to be missionaries. So my grandparents served in China, and my father in the Philippines. So I was born a year after the war. Moved all over the place. Born in New Jersey. Lived on Long Island when I was very little. Then my father took over the Armed Services YMCA in Newport, Rhode Island, so we moved to Newport. And we had a house first in Newport and then in Portsmouth, Rhode Island. And then moved to New Jersey in 1956. And my father took a job with the World Service YMCA in New York City. And after several years in New Jersey, he decided to follow in his father's footsteps back into World Service YMCA, and he started the YMCA in Guatemala. So my brother and sisters were grown and out of the house, but I went with them to Guatemala. So I lived in Guatemala for several years as well. So that was the start of things.
Yeah. And where did you go to school and what did you study?
Okay, in Guatemala, I don't know if you remember the years or not, but this was the early 1960s, and Guatemala looked like a wonderfully attractive place for my father to start a YMCA. But Guatemala was slowly sliding into a communist insurgency, and the CIA and American forces had set up training bases all over Guatemala for Cuban freedom fighters, anticipating the invasion of Cuba. So there was a large military presence there, and an insurgency that decided, communist insurgency that decided to try and get rid of the Americans. So it was building up to a Vietnam kind of a situation before Vietnam was even building up to it. So I went to high school there, and that was okay for a couple of years, but things were going downhill, and my family decided that probably it was better for me to come back to the States if I was ever going to finish school down there. Things were getting pretty exciting. So my sister lived in Lakeville, and it was decided, and I agreed to it, that I should come up here and finish it was the last part of my junior year and then my senior year at Hussey, so I graduated from here. And after graduating from here, I had caught the bug for archaeology, having lived in Guatemala, my archaeology in particular. And Tulane University was in the forefront of my archaeology in those days. So I went off to Tulane University And in my second year, things were starting to happen in San Francisco. You've been in San Francisco, this was the late 60s. And I did not react well to the blatant and violent racism of the South in those years in New Orleans, and where I was, it was very prevalent. And I had a tough time with that. So I left school in my sophomore year and went out west and kicked around on the West Coast for 4 years. Gained a lot of experience in building while I was out there and construction. And then after 4 years came back because my sister was here and I decided to settle down finally. Was tired of moving around in my life. And so I moved here to this house in 1972 and have been here ever since.
Wow, that's great.
A lot of moving around.
Yeah.
I was tired of it. A lot of people look forward to moving around when they get to be adults, but by the time I was 24 years old, I did not want to move again. So I made this my base of operations ever since.
And what have you been doing?
Lots of other things. All right, so with a partner, I started a small renovation and building business. We did all kinds of different things, home services and house painting, roofing. We rebuilt the old railroad station in Cornwall Bridge. We did all kinds of things. And I was also involved, you've probably, as long as you've been here, heard of River Run Outfitters in Falls Village. Was a
Sure.
So I started the Whitewater School at River Run Outfitters.
Ah.
Not the whole business, just the Whitewater School.
Yeah.
So in conjunction with the building thing, I ran the Whitewater School for a couple of years. And then in 1977, my first relationship had broken up, and I had a son that I had to be responsible for. So responsibility hit me between the eyes finally, and I decided I really needed to settle into a career. So at that point in time, they were hiring people like me, whatever that like me was in those days. The Department of Correction was hiring, so I went to work for the state of Connecticut with the Department of Correction and worked my way up through the ranks with the department, and eventually had the pay grade of a captain, but I was involved in a lot of bureaucratic stuff. I was a shift commander at one time in the largest freestanding correctional drug and alcohol treatment program in the country, in Newtown, of all places. And I retired from the department having a position as an auditor. My unit was responsible for auditing all of the prisons and jails in the state for compliance with directives, and that was my last couple of years on the job. And I retired in 1997. And then I had already taken volunteer positions with the town, and so I knew a lot about the town. I was during the late 80s and early 90s, while I was still working for the department, I was on the Housatonic River Commission. I was the chairman of the River Commission for several years. And then in 1997, after I retired, they elected me to the Board of Education, and immediately elected me the chairman of the Board of Education. And did that for 2 years, and ran for first selectman. And was a first selectman of the 21st century. So I did that for a while, and then I was Board of Finance after that, and then just a member of the Board of Selectmen for 14 years, I think, something like that. Finally retired from the town in 2017. So my wife and I have been involved in church work over the years together, and I retired to indulge my original passion of history. So in retirement now, I'm an historian and writer. So I've had 3 books published so far. So
I want to get to those.
okay.
But what could you tell me about your years as first selectman? Do you have any stories of favorite experiences?
Being a first selectman is an enormous experience in itself.
Uh-huh.
And this town, I don't know how far you go back with the town, but the town approaching the year 2000 was a very divided and contentious place. And most of that came about as a result of the school building project. School building projects have a way of dividing towns. And it was projected that Kellogg School was going to have an influx of a lot of kids over the next couple of decades, and the school needed to build an addition to accommodate them. And the town became badly split on whether or not to do it and what the design of it was going to be, if the town was going to have it. So, and the other thing was the old town hall had become way too small. I don't know if you know where that was across the street from the current town hall, where the cafe is now. The town offices were downstairs. So that was a difficult issue. They went, the old National Iron Bank had been offered to the town. The bank was moving out of the town and it offered it to the town basically for nothing. And that was another very difficult, contentious issue because there were some people in the town who wanted to have that building. And they made it difficult for the town to actually acquire it and move in, so that was another big deal. And the other thing was the senior center in the old town hall was being renovated. And that was a huge project, and that was difficult from the start to get that done. There was a problem with the design of the structure, and a neighbor who did not want to accommodate the scaffolding that was going to be needed, and at the last minute it had to be, the whole entire design had to be changed the day I took office. So as far as the biggest story, that was probably one of the biggest stories. Moving into a new job and being told that the design that they were ready to build, bulldozers moving in, couldn't be built because of problems with the neighbors. So we had to immediately redesign that and get started on that project. So there were 3 huge projects over the years that I was first selectman, and trying to give a semblance of peace to the town in the process of doing it, but getting things taken care of anyway. So,
How did you do that? How did you bring both sides together?
I had worked in a prison. And to survive in prison work, you have to be able to get along with people and listen to people, take people seriously. But at the same time, when a decision has to be made, you have to make it and just move forward. Having listened to everybody, gotten all the input you need, when there's a good plan, then it's time to put that behind you and move on. So.
Yeah.
Being decisive, being able to mend fences, talk to people, be decisive when you need to be.
Now about your books.
Okay.
These are about Mayan archaeology?
Nope. History, though.
Uh-huh.
You got the historical part of it. Okay. There's a pile next to you, the books I've had published. The one at the bottom is the first one, which is a family history and genealogy. And the second one, in following family around historically, I found out that I have a 4th great-grandfather, unbeknownst to the family living now, that was a Revolutionary War soldier. And he served in almost every theater of the Revolutionary War from 1775 on up to 1780. So without being overtly following him, I follow him around and find out the stories of the things that he was involved in. So it's not about him, but it's about some of the kind of untold stories of the Revolution. So the second book was about the 17th Continental Regiment, which was a Connecticut regiment in 1776. They went off to fight in the Battle of Long Island in August 1776 and was never heard from again. They were obliterated. And nothing, when I started research, had ever been written about that unit and what happened to them. So the second book was about that. That's the one in the middle. And that one was, these are all heritage books, my publisher. And I write books that fit into their format for publishing. So they like Revolutionary War stuff. So that was the second book. The third book, I discovered that my 4th great-grandfather had also, after he had survived the destruction of his regiment at the Battle of Long Island, was interred by the British in one of their nightmarish prisons in downtown Manhattan, where most of the survivors of the Battle of Long Island were interred and died because of smallpox and other diseases. He was, out of 250 men, there were about 40 that survived. He was one of them. And he enlisted again several months later and went on to serve in another Connecticut regiment, and then in what was called the Rhode Island Brigade, where there were a lot of Connecticut guys that fought in Rhode Island during the Revolutionary War to contain the British in Newport. The British took over Newport in December 1776, and they stayed there until 1780, and this brigade, the Rhode Island Brigade, contained them and kept them on Newport Island, prevented the British from attacking the mainland again for that period of time. So that's the last one I had done.
Can we go back to the days you spent working in the corrections department?
Sure.
What are some of the stories that you encountered working in prisons?
You know, that's an amusing road to go down, because I found out pretty quickly that most of the world doesn't want to hear the stories of what goes on in prison work. The stuff is just almost beyond belief that happens in prisons. It doesn't happen all the time. I think probably inside a prison, the most predominant state of being is boredom. But when things happen, they tend to happen in a big way all at once. And that tends to be really bad stuff. So, and my brothers in arms, so to speak, would gather occasionally and tell war stories, usually over a beer at a bar or whatever. And at the end of the conversation and the night, we would say, "My gosh, we got to write this stuff down." But we pretty quickly realized that nobody would believe any of it.
Well, give me some examples. I'll believe it.
Oh gosh.
Do you have any riots or revolts or?
You know, one of the biggest thing that probably happened, I came in on the tail end of it, and that was in the beginning of 1977, I think it was, end of 76, 77, when I started to work for the department in, what was it, June 1977. So it may have been that fall, but I moved, I was at the Litchfield jail for the first year that I worked there, and then I took the permanent job after probation to Cheshire Correctional. When I went to work down there, they'd had probably one of the most serious incidents to have happened for several years in corrections anywhere. And that's where two guys who had been transferred from the maximum security prison in Summers went as trustees to Cheshire. Both of them had been convicted of murder. And it was those years where you could, departments of correction, if you'd done really well when you're inside, didn't matter how violent a person you had been, you could work your way up as a trustee. And these guys were living outside of the main barrier at Cheshire, the security barrier, the front gate. And they were living in a facility upstairs in the front of Cheshire that had been administrative offices and what they called a BOQ, the old bachelor officers' quarters on the third floor out front. These two guys lived up there, and they were granted privileges of furlough every weekend because they were close to the end of their sentences. They'd been trusted. They were working inside the prison during the day, and they were given furloughs at night, or on the weekends. And unbeknownst to anybody, they were gathering weapons and storing them, coming back from furlough with these weapons that even the state police hadn't heard about being manufactured. And they were storing them in their quarters out front. And what they were going to do was, on their way down to work one morning, when the front gates were open to bring them in, they were going to go and shoot the warden and shoot the the guys who were in the guard room going into the prison, and then let everybody go. And somehow the shift commander one night found out that these guys had been involved in something really bad, and got in touch with the duty officer, who was the deputy warden, and explained the situation. The deputy warden said, keep them inside, because they were inside at work. keep them inside, go upstairs and find out what's up in their quarters upstairs. So the shift commander went to these two inmates and said he was going to have to lock them up, and they pleaded with him, no, 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 just let us go upstairs and get our stuff. You know, we need our toothpaste and brushes and clothes and stuff like that, and we'll come right back down again. And the shift commander was smart enough and said no. So he just locked them up in the segregation unit, went upstairs, and they found this massive arsenal up in the bachelor officers' quarters where these guys had been. And it turns out on weekends they've been going out, and they found a couple of very weak girls to shack up with, and basically were keeping them hostage on the weekends and giving them a place to stay. They were terrified of these guys. They'd done everything you can imagine to them, to these girls, and amassed an arsenal. So that was probably the most dangerous situation. And I just came in on the tail end of that, as that whole thing was reverberating throughout the facility and throughout the department too. It caused a complete rethinking of what it was to be a trustee in the Connecticut State prison system. And I don't believe that any seriously dangerous offenders were ever granted trustee status after that. So there, that kind of thing. I was involved in a number of fights, and
I was going to ask, did you ever have to get physical with
yes,
the prisoners?
yeah. Not in a punitive way, but in a way to either defend myself or help defend other people when things went bad. So yeah, it's not easy work. For me, it was a rewarding job because I had taken that job when I was 30, and I was probably past that stage in my life where I thought I could change the world, and I just wanted to do a good job of what I was doing. And for me, it was a good opportunity for a year. They took care of me. They promoted me through the ranks, and I've always been very grateful to the guys that I worked for, and the state and the Department of Correction for taking care of me and giving me a career.
Good.
Yeah.
Good.
It's kind of amazing though that I lived through more than 8 years at Cheshire, which was a medium maximum security prison and jail to begin with, and was promoted to a job as a shift commander out at that substance abuse program I told you about in Newtown, which was minimum security. And we had more fighting to do there than I ever had to do. And even though it was minimum security, and the people who were there were supposed to have been carefully screened to be in the program, they couldn't. Some of them could not handle being in a minimum security environment. And the hardest thing was if somebody's messed up, and we would have to pack them in, which meant bringing them back into a secure facility again. They wouldn't want to go. So there were very difficult situations and restraint that had to happen with inmates to get them back inside where they and everybody else would be safer. So, yeah. One situation at Cheshire, just responding to the code that went out over the loudspeaker system, that there was a fight going on the 3rd floor in the south wing, and there was a stairwell, and it was kind of a blind stairwell. It was a very bad situation security-wise. So I was the first amongst a bunch of guys to go charging up the stairs, and I failed to notice that there was a inmate coming down at me with a table leg. And at the last moment, I noticed that table leg was being swung on my head. And the fellow behind me had seen it before I did, and just rushed right by me on the stairwell and tackled the guy. And this was the staff member was somebody who had been an inmate just a couple of years before, and that they'd hired in the department, and he saved my life.
You've been in Falls Village a long time,
Yeah.
since 1972, I think
Yep,
you said.
Yep, 1972.
How has it changed?
Gone more upscale.
More upscale.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When I moved here, there were a lot of families and people that had been here for generations, and a lot of blue-collar folks, and I mean that in the best sense, hard-working people. And this had been the place where they had been raised, and their parents and parents before them in a lot of cases. There are very few of those people left, and I kind of miss that. Falls Village has gone upscale. It was inevitable that was going to happen because it's such a beautiful little rural area, and a town the likes of which there aren't a lot left this close to New York City. And it's for a lot of years it was a very well kept secret, and now it's gone upscale. Property values, our kids can't live here, can't afford housing, that kind of thing. Falls Village used to be a very reasonable place to find real estate, even after the other towns in the area, Salisbury, Sharon, Cornwall, their property values had soared. That was slow to happen in Falls Village. So this was a place like North Canaan where you could find a property reasonably. That's changed.
Good. We've jumped around quite a bit, but we've covered...
My life jumped around a lot. Yeah, I'm on my umpteenth career, so this one is fun.